I'm Maya, 31 years old, and last spring, I left my daughter Sophie at my parents' mountain cabin so I could attend a career-changing education conference. 3 days, that's all it was supposed to be. But when I came back early, I found Sophie lying alone in a guest room with a swollen, broken leg, and a story that shattered what was left of my trust in my family. My father, a retired surgeon, my brother, an orthopedic doctor, my mother, the queen of control. They had all ignored her pain for a dinner party. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't neglect by accident. This was who they truly were. Before I tell you the full story, drop a comment to say where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to choose between peace and protection, hit like and subscribe. You're not alone. Life as a single mom isn't exactly a walk in the park. After my divorce from Nathan 5 years ago, it's been a constant rhythm of pushing forward, making sure Sophie has everything she needs, wrapped in stability and love. Nathan's a great dad, sends child support religiously, but his job took him across the country, so visits are, well, sporadic. Sophie, bless her heart, has always been mature for her age. She understands, but I've always felt that gnawing need to work double time, to fill that space, to be both mom and dad. It's a heavy hat to wear sometimes, but for her, I'd wear a whole closet full of them. Now, my relationship with my own parents, Leonard and Margaret, it's always been, shall we say, complicated. They live in this beautiful mountain retreat about 2 hours from our little townhome in the suburbs. It's picturesque, you know? A charming wooden cabin, a private dock on a serene alpine lake, forest trails weaving through the towering pines. It's the kind of place Sophie absolutely adores visiting. But beneath that picture postcard exterior, there's always been a colder reality, a current running beneath the surface that I could never quite pinpoint until recently. Growing up, I was never quite enough for them. My father, Leonard, a retired surgeon, he expected perfection, not just good, but perfect. Every grade, every decision, every aspect of my life was scrutinized under his microscopic gaze. And my mother, Margaret, a former school principal, she wielded criticism like a finely honed instrument. It wasn't loud or overtly cruel, but it was relentless. It chipped away at you, slowly, persistently. My straight A's? Could have been all pluses. My appearance? A bit too casual, don't you think, Maya? My career choice? Teaching, not medicine. That was a constant low hum of disapproval. Even now, at 31, with a master's degree and a stable job as a high school English teacher, I swear around them, I still feel like I'm 16 and utterly inadequate. Like I'm constantly waiting for their judgment, bracing for the next subtle cut. And then there's my brother, Daniel. 3 years younger than me, yet somehow always above reproach, the golden child, the boy wonder. He followed our father's footsteps directly into medicine, of course. When he became an orthopedic surgeon, just like Dad, you'd have thought he'd single-handedly cured cancer, judging by my parents' reaction. Daniel could do no wrong, while I seemingly could do no right. It was a dynamic I'd internalized for so long, I almost didn't see it for what it was. Despite all of this, all the decades of feeling like I was perpetually under a microscope, I maintained contact. And I did it for one simple, profound reason, Sophie. I believed she deserved to know her grandparents and her uncle. And to be fair, in their own peculiar way, they adored her. They really did. Sophie loved fishing with Grandpa Leonard, casting lines into the tranquil lake, patiently waiting for a bite. She loved baking with Grandma Margaret, even if Margaret's kitchen was immaculate, and baking felt more like a precise science experiment than a joyful culinary adventure. And she absolutely loved listening to Uncle Daniel's hospital stories, his dramatic tales from the operating room, delivered with a flair that always captivated her imagination. I tried so hard to shield her from their subtle criticisms, the same ones that had chipped away at my own self-worth for decades. The little comments about her posture, her choice of clothes, even the way she ate. For the most part, I think I succeeded. I'd redirect, deflect, or simply pretend not to hear. I was so used to it, I barely registered it as abnormal. So when my principal selected me to represent our school at an educational conference in Phoenix, I knew it was a big deal. A potential stepping stone to the department head position I'd been working toward for years. It was a career-defining moment, but it also meant leaving Sophie, And so, with a knot of reluctance tightening in my stomach, I arranged for Grace to stay with my parents for the weekend. "It's only 3 days, Mom," Sophie said, her voice bright, as she packed her favorite books. At 12, she was in that beautiful, almost magical transition phase. Still my little girl in so many ways, but blossoming, day by day, into her own unique person. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, and her blue eyes sparkled with excitement at the thought of a mountain adventure. "I'll be fine. Plus, Grandpa said we might go hiking to the waterfall." I checked her suitcase, adding an extra sweater. April in Colorado can be unpredictable, especially up in the mountains. One minute it's sunny, the next a storm rolls in. "I know you'll be fine, sweetie," I said, trying to sound as confident as I wanted to feel. "Just remember to take your allergy medication every morning and don't let Grandpa give you too much sugar before bed, okay?" "I know, Mom," she rolled her eyes playfully, a familiar, comforting gesture. "We've done this before, and we had. But never for more than a day or two. Something about this trip felt different. Heavier somehow. Maybe it was the importance of the conference, the pressure I felt. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the way Daniel had inserted himself into the weekend plans at the very last minute. He and his wife, Chloe, were apparently having issues. Classic Daniel, always drama. And he decided that a weekend at our parents' mountain cabin was just what he needed to clear his head. Daniel's presence always shifted the family dynamic. It was like he amplified their worst tendencies. Leonard and Margaret would become even more dismissive of me, as if by elevating Daniel, they could diminish me further. It was exhausting. Friday afternoon, I drove Sophie to the mountain house. The property looked beautiful in early spring. The budding trees, a vibrant green, hinted at the coming summer. Glimpses of the lake shimmered through the dense woods. The charming A-frame house, which my father had built himself before I was even born, stood solid and imposing. My parents greeted us on the porch. Margaret, true to form, immediately fussed over Sophie's light jacket. "That's not nearly warm enough for the forecast, dear," she criticized, her voice tight with disapproval, even as she ushered Sophie inside. "I've laid out some appropriate clothes for the weekend." I bit my tongue. Sophie shot me a quick glance, a look that spoke volumes. "It's okay, Mom. I'll handle Grandma." She was a pro at it, honestly. Leonard barely acknowledged me, his attention already fixated on telling Sophie about the hiking trail he'd meticulously mapped out for Saturday. "The waterfall is gorgeous this time of year with the snow melt," he boomed, already leading her towards the door again, map in hand. "You'll need proper shoes, not those flimsy sneakers." "I packed her hiking boots, Dad," I said, trying to insert myself into the conversation, as I set Sophie's suitcase down in the guest room. "They're the ones you and Mom got her for Christmas." He nodded distractedly, already moving on. "Daniel's bringing steaks for dinner tomorrow. He should be here around noon." Of course, Daniel's arrival was clearly going to be the highlight of the weekend. My presence, as usual, was merely a logistical requirement. Before leaving, I pulled my mother aside in the kitchen, lowering my voice. "Mom, Sophie sometimes gets homesick at night. If she needs to call me even late, please just let her." Margaret waved dismissively, already turning to fuss with something on the counter. "Maya, honestly, we've raised children before. Successfully, I might add." The implication, as always, that I somehow hadn't been raised successfully, or that my parenting was inferior, wasn't lost on me. It never was. "Sophie will be fine. We don't cuddle her like you do." I swallowed my retort. It felt like a lifetime of swallowing retorts around them. "Also," I continued, trying to sound calm, trying to push past her barbed words, "she's been having some knee pain from soccer. If it flares up, there's ibuprofen in her toiletry bag." Her tone was clipped, final. "Leonard was a surgeon for 30 years and Daniel is a doctor. I think we can handle a little knee pain." When Daniel arrived as I was preparing to leave, he barely spared me a greeting before sweeping Sophie into a bear hug. "There's my favorite niece," he boomed, his voice radiating an almost theatrical bonhomie. "Ready for an adventure weekend with the cool uncle?" Sophie laughed, genuinely delighted, and I forced a smile. Daniel had always been good with Sophie, if somewhat overbearing. His gift-giving was excessive, his stories exaggerated, his entire persona with her felt performative. But Sophie adored him, and that was all that mattered. "Drive safe, Maya," was all he said to me as I hugged Sophie goodbye. I held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize this feeling of her in my arms. "Be good, sweetie. Call me tonight before bed, okay?" I whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you more than anything." "Love you too, Mom," she whispered back, pulling away, her eyes still sparkling with the excitement of the adventure ahead. "Don't worry so much. Your conference is going to be amazing." As I drove away, I watched Sophie in my rearview mirror, waving enthusiastically from between my stern-faced parents and my smirking brother. That image. That utterly mundane, innocent image. It would haunt me later. My bright, trusting daughter, surrounded by the three people who would betray her so profoundly. Sound of a transition, like a podcast segment break. The Phoenix conference started well enough. My presentation on innovative literacy techniques for diverse learners was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, and Friday's keynote speeches provided invaluable networking opportunities. I met so many inspiring educators. Still, I found myself checking my phone frequently, a nervous habit I couldn't break. I'd smile at Sophie's occasional texts, a photo of the banana pancakes Grandma Margaret made, or a message about a woodpecker she spotted near the dock. Simple, sweet things. Friday evening, I called as promised, but no one answered. I tried 3 times over 2 hours, my concern growing with each unanswered ring. Finally, around 9:30 p.m., my father, Leonard, called back. "Sophie is already asleep," he said curtly, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. "We had a busy day getting the boat ready for summer, and she was exhausted." "Could you wake her?" I pleaded, my voice tight. "I promised I'd say goodnight." "Maya, don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, the familiar condescension dripping from his words. "The child needs rest, not to be disturbed because you're feeling insecure about being away." I swallowed my frustration, a bitter taste rising in my throat. "Can you just have her call me first thing tomorrow? We're hiking early." "She'll call you when we get back," he cut in before I could protest further. And then, without another word, he hung up. Typical Leonard behavior, deciding what was best for everyone without a shred of consultation. I tried texting Sophie directly, but the message remained undelivered. I reasoned that the Mountain House's notoriously spotty cell service was to blame, a frustrating but common occurrence. I tried to push the worry down, to focus on reviewing my presentation notes for the next day. What I didn't know then, what Sophie would later recount to me through tears in a sterile hospital bed, was what Saturday would truly bring. According to Sophie, the morning began pleasantly enough. Daniel arrived before breakfast, bringing a box of donuts and an excessive, almost theatrical enthusiasm for the day's hike. My father had mapped out an ambitious trail, a loop from the property to the waterfall and back. About 7 miles total. Sophie was excited, but also nervous about the distance. "Maybe we should do the shorter trail," she'd suggested timidly over breakfast, her voice small. "Mom and I usually do the 3-mile one." "Your mother coddles you," my father had responded immediately, his dismissive tone slicing through the morning calm. "You're old enough for a real hike. Besides, Daniel wants to see the upper falls." And so it was decided. What Sophie wanted, or what she felt comfortable with, was completely irrelevant. What Daniel wanted, what the golden child desired, was the priority. A family dynamic I knew all too well, one that had dictated so many of my own childhood experiences. They set out around 9 o'clock that morning. Sophie wore the proper hiking boots I'd packed, along with jeans and layers, as the spring day in the mountains promised to warm up quickly. Her small backpack contained water, trail mix, and her phone, which my mother promptly confiscated. "No electronics in nature, dear," Margaret declared with an air of absolute authority. "This is family time," as if a phone was some kind of poison that would somehow spoil their manufactured family bonding experience. Sophie, used to her grandma's eccentric rules, didn't argue. The first half of the hike went smoothly. They reached the waterfall by noon, where they ate the sandwiches Margaret had packed. Sophie described how beautiful the falls were, swollen with spring runoff, cascading dramatically over moss-covered rocks. She recounted the mist on her face, the roar of the water, the feeling of wildness. It sounded idyllic. A shift in tone, more somber. It was on their return journey, about a mile from the waterfall, that everything went wrong. The path narrowed as it followed a rushing stream, becoming rocky and slick with spray from the churning water. Sophie was careful, she said, picking her way cautiously. But my father and Daniel, ever impatient, Set a brisk pace ahead. Margaret followed close behind them. No one was watching when Sophie's foot slipped on a moss-covered rock. Her leg twisted awkwardly as she fell, and she heard it. A sickening, undeniable crack. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She screamed. A raw, primal sound that echoed through the forest. My family rushed back to find her crumpled on the trail, clutching her right leg, tears streaming down her face. Sophie later recounted, her voice still shaky. "It's broken," she gasped. Something snapped, I heard it. Daniel knelt beside her, his medical training finally, mercifully, useful. He examined her leg, which was already beginning to swell, rapidly, visibly. "Looks like a tibia fracture," he concluded, his voice surprisingly calm, clinical. "We need to get her to an ER." Sophie said she felt a momentary wave of relief wash over her. Uncle Daniel was a doctor. He would help her. They would call her mom, me, and everything would be okay. This nightmare would end. But then my father, Leonard, checked his watch. "We have dinner with the Millers at 7, he reminded Margaret, his voice laced with annoyance rather than concern. "We'd never make it to the hospital and back in time." "Can't we cancel?" Sophie asked through her tears, her voice barely a whisper. "It really hurts." Margaret's lips thinned, a familiar sign of her displeasure. "The Millers are your grandfather's oldest friends, Grace. We've had this dinner planned for months." The dinner, always the dinner. Sophie looked to Daniel, hoping her uncle, the doctor, would insist on proper medical care. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in her eyes. Instead, he shrugged, a casual, indifferent shrug. "It's probably just a hairline fracture, kiddo. Not a big deal. We can ice it at the house and reassess." "But how will I get back?" Sophie cried, the pain making her dizzy, her head spinning with agony. "I can't walk on this." The solution my family devised still makes my blood boil when I think about it. My father fashioned a makeshift walking stick from a sturdy branch. Daniel, the doctor, declared that walking it off might actually be good. "Weight-bearing fractures heal better," he claimed. A dangerously oversimplified and utterly irresponsible medical assertion, especially for a 12-year-old with a visibly injured leg. And Margaret simply stated that they didn't have time for dramatics. No one carried her. No one went for help. No one even considered calling an ambulance, or me, her mother. Instead, they forced my 12-year-old daughter to walk 3 hours back to the house on a broken leg. Sophie described the journey as a blur of unimaginable pain. Every single step was agony. She cried until she had no tears left, then continued in silent, excruciating suffering. She begged for her phone to call me. They refused. She asked to rest. They allowed only brief, hurried stops, constantly urging her along with reminders of the precious dinner engagement. By the time they reached the house, Sophie's leg was grotesquely swollen, engorged and distorted. Her skin was mottled with bruising, a sickening mosaic of purple and black from knee to ankle. She couldn't put any weight on it at all anymore, not even a fraction. So Daniel and my father, finally, half-carried her the final quarter-mile, dragging her limp body through the front door. At the house, their treatment consisted of ice, 2 ibuprofen tablets, and elevating her leg on pillows in the guest room. Margaret brought her soup and crackers, then left her alone while they all showered and dressed for dinner. "We'll only be gone a few hours," my mother told her, her voice light as if this were a normal, pleasant evening. "There's water by your bed and the TV remote. Try to rest." Sophie, in excruciating pain and profound abandonment, watched through the window as all 3 of them, her grandparents and her uncle, the doctor, drove away to dinner, leaving her completely alone with a broken leg in a house 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. She tried using the landline to call me, a desperate, last-ditch effort for connection, for help, only to discover it was dead. A tree had fallen on the line earlier that week, a detail my family had conveniently forgotten to mention. With no cell phone and no way to call for help, Sophie lay in bed, alternating between tearful agony and stretches of exhausted, pain-induced unconsciousness. Sound of rushing, frantic music or sound effects. Meanwhile, I was miles away in Phoenix, texting and calling repeatedly from my hotel room, growing increasingly frantic as Saturday evening stretched into night with no word from my family or my daughter. By Sunday morning, I was beside myself with worry. No calls, no texts. Nothing since Friday afternoon. I'd left dozens of messages for my parents, for Daniel, even trying their neighbors, my mind cycling through every possible catastrophic scenario. The final session of my conference wasn't until 2 p.m., but by 9 o'clock that morning, I'd made my decision. I informed the organizers of a family emergency, packed my bags in a blur, and hit the road for the 3-hour drive back to Colorado. The entire drive, my mind cycled through every scenario, from the mundane, dead batteries, poor reception, to the truly catastrophic. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, a tremor that wouldn't stop. The familiar winding roads felt alien, ominous. By the time I turned onto the gravel road leading to my parents' property, my heart was hammering against my ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage. The first thing I noticed was that all 3 cars were there. My father's SUV, my mother's sedan, and Daniel's ostentatious sports car. At least they were home. That was something. A small flicker of relief. I pulled up to the house around noon, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my tires in the otherwise silent mountain air. No one came out to greet me. The house looked peaceful, almost serene, utterly belying the storm brewing inside me. I walked in without knocking. It was still my childhood home, after all. The scene in the living room was surreal in its normalcy. My parents and Daniel were playing Scrabble at the coffee table, a picture of domestic tranquility. Coffee mugs and sundae pastries were arranged neatly nearby. All 3 looked up in surprise when I entered. Maya, my mother said, her tone suggesting I'd committed some social faux pas by arriving early, by disrupting their Sunday morning ritual. We weren't expecting you until tonight. I've been trying to reach you for nearly 2 days, I said, struggling to keep my voice level, to keep the rising tide of panic from spilling over. Where's Sophie? Still sleeping, Daniel replied casually, barely glancing up from his Scrabble tiles. She's fine, just taking it easy after a little tumble on the trail yesterday. The dismissive way he said it, a little tumble, sent alarm bells clanging violently in my head. What tumble? What happened? My father sighed, setting down his tiles with an air of exasperated inconvenience. She slipped on some rocks and hurt her leg. Nothing serious. We've been keeping an eye on it. If it's nothing serious, why didn't anyone call me? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts. Why hasn't she called me? The landline's down, my mother offered, almost defensively. And you know cell service is spotty up here. Where's her phone? I demanded, my eyes narrowing. I have it, my mother admitted, a hint of defiance in her tone. She was getting too dependent on it. We wanted her to enjoy the weekend without technology. I didn't wait to hear more. I couldn't. A cold dread had begun to coil in my gut. I strode toward the guest bedroom, my parents and Daniel trailing behind me, still offering excuses and assurances that I was overreacting. The sight of Sophie stopped me cold in the doorway. My daughter lay on the bed, her face pale and drawn with pain, her eyes rimmed red from crying. Her right leg, propped on pillows, was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, grotesquely distended. The bruising was so dark it looked almost black in places. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Mom, she whispered, fresh tears spilling. You came early. I was at her side in an instant, dropping to my knees beside the bed. What happened, sweetheart? What did they do to you? Through broken sobs, Sophie told me everything. About the fall, the sickening crack she'd heard, the agonizing 3-hour walk back to the house, how they'd left her alone to attend their dinner, how no one believed how bad it was, how much it hurt. All night long, as she spoke, I gently examined her leg, my horror mounting with every detail. The misalignment was visible even to my untrained eye. This wasn't a sprain. This wasn't a minor fracture. This was serious. This was beyond serious. I turned to face my family, who stood clustered in the doorway, their faces a mixture of defensiveness and mild annoyance. You made her walk on this for 3 hours? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet vibrating with a dangerous intensity. And then you left her alone. We gave her pain medication, my mother defended weakly, her voice thin. 2 ibuprofen, Sophie corrected in a small, shaky voice. Daniel said it was just a hairline fracture, my father added, gesturing to my brother as if his medical degree somehow made this neglect acceptable, justifiable. Daniel shrugged, an infuriatingly casual gesture. It looked minor yesterday. Besides, kids are resilient. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like they were speaking a different language, operating on a different plane of reality. She needs a hospital. No, don't be dramatic, Maya, my father said, his voice instantly taking on that condescending tone that had silenced me throughout my childhood. If you'd let me look at it. No, I cut him off, my voice deadly calm, a dangerous quiet building in me. You've done enough. I knew with absolute clarity what I had to do. I'm taking my daughter to the emergency room. I gathered Sophie carefully in my arms, ignoring my family's continued protests, their bizarre mixture of defensive excuses and suddenly helpful, empty suggestions. Should we come with you? My mother asked, stepping forward as I carefully settled Sophie in the backseat of my car, arranging pillows to elevate her leg. No, I answered, without looking at her, without a shred of hesitation. You've done enough. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The 20-minute drive to the nearest hospital was tense, filled only with Sophie's soft whimpers each time the car hit a bump. I called ahead so they'd be ready for us. By the time we arrived, Sophie's pain had escalated to the point where she could barely speak, her little body trembling. The emergency room staff took one look at her leg, its grotesque swelling, its livid bruising, and rushed us into a treatment room. The doctor, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Harrison, ordered immediate x-rays and pain medication. Sophie was finally getting the care she needed, the care she should have received hours ago, days ago. When Dr. Harrison returned with the x-rays, her expression was grave. She didn't need to say anything, her eyes told me everything. Sophie has a displaced tibial shaft fracture, she explained, showing me the x-rays, pointing to the screen. See this angle here? The bone has completely broken and shifted. My breath hitched. What concerns me most is the delay in treatment. Walking on this injury has caused significant soft tissue damage and increased the risk of complications. What kind of complications? I asked, my throat tight, my heart pounding in my ears. Compartment syndrome is our immediate concern, she explained, her voice serious. That's increased pressure within the muscle compartment that can damage nerves and blood vessels. There's also a risk of infection, improper healing, and long-term mobility issues. What does she need? I barely managed to get the words out. Dr. Harrison said firmly, without a doubt in her voice, surgery. We need to realign the bone and stabilize it with screws and a plate. Our orthopedic surgeon is being called in. He'll be here within the hour. I nodded, trying to process everything, trying to absorb the enormity of what she was saying. And if this had been treated immediately after the injury? I asked, a desperate hope blooming, then immediately wilting. Dr. Harrison's expression told me everything I needed to know. A clean break might have needed just a cast. Walking on it changed everything. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of my family's monstrous negligence. As Sophie was prepared for surgery, I sat beside her bed, holding her small, trembling hand. The weight of what my family had done, the unnecessary pain they'd caused, the complications they'd created, it settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I had entrusted them with my most precious person, my entire world, and they had utterly, irrevocably failed us both. When my parents and Daniel appeared in the doorway of the treatment room an hour later, I felt nothing but cold, crystalline rage. The pediatric orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Adams, arrived promptly after examining Sophie and reviewing her x-rays. He confirmed what Dr. Harrison had told us. Sophie would need emergency surgery to repair the displaced fracture and address the soft tissue damage caused by walking on the broken bone. We'll need to place a titanium rod and several screws, he explained, his voice calm and professional, despite the chaos around us. In a child her age, we typically try to avoid such invasive measures, but the displacement is severe, and there's significant soft tissue involvement. Sophie squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear, her small face pale. Will it hurt? She whispered, looking up at Dr. Adams. His expression softened immediately. You'll be asleep for the surgery, sweetheart, and we'll manage your pain carefully afterward. The good news is that young bones heal remarkably well with proper care and physical therapy. You should regain full function. As they prepared to take Sophie to surgery, I kissed her forehead, promising to be there, right there, the moment she woke up. The moment they wheeled her away, a pang of pure terror shot through me, but I pushed it down. I turned to face my family, who had been hovering awkwardly by the door, a picture of feigned concern. Maya, don't you think you're overreacting? My father began, stepping forward, his voice laced with his familiar, infuriating dismissiveness. Surgery seems extreme. If they'd just let me examine her properly. Stop, I said, my voice low and controlled, barely above a whisper, but vibrating with a force that made them flinch back. Just stop. We didn't know it was this serious, my mother interjected, her voice reedy. Sophie didn't indicate it was this bad. She was crying in pain for hours, I countered, the quiet fury beginning to build. She heard the bone break. She told you it was broken. Kids exaggerate, Daniel said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if this were an irrefutable medical fact. I see it all the time in my practice. They come in thinking they're dying when it's just a sprained ankle. Something in me snapped. A lifetime of being minimized, of being told I was too emotional, of my concerns being dismissed as dramatics, boiled over. This isn't just anything, Daniel. This is a displaced tibial fracture with soft tissue damage. You're an orthopedic surgeon. You should have recognized the severity immediately. And in a proper examination setting, maybe, he defended, trying to regain some professional composure. Out on a trail with limited visibility. Then you should have erred on the side of caution, I was shouting now, drawing concerned looks from the nursing staff walking by. I immediately lowered my voice, forcing myself to be calm, to be concise, to make them understand. You should have carried her out, called for help, done literally anything other than force her to walk for 3 hours on a broken leg. We had dinner plans, my mother said weakly, as if that explained everything. I stared at her, incredulous. Dinner plans? Dinner plans? You left my injured minor child alone in an empty house with no working phone because of dinner plans. The Millers are very important to your father, she explained, as if this clarified everything, as if it were a perfectly valid reason. More important than Sophie's health? Than her safety? I asked, my voice trembling with raw disbelief. Now, Maya, my father interjected, using the condescending tone that had silenced me throughout my childhood, that had always made me feel small and unreasonable. You're being emotional. These doctors are probably overreacting to cover themselves legally. I've seen it countless times. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. My sprained wrist at 10, that my father declared just bruised, until the school nurse sent me for x-rays 3 days later. The time Daniel broke our neighbor's window, but I was punished because Daniel wouldn't do that. The consistent, persistent pattern of minimizing my concerns while elevating Daniel's opinions, of my reality being warped to fit their narrative. Sophie could have permanent damage, I said quietly, opening my eyes to look at each of them, trying to make them see the gravity of what they had done. She's 12 years old and may need physical therapy for months because you couldn't miss a dinner party, because you couldn't admit that maybe, just maybe, her pain was real and significant. She'll be fine, Daniel insisted, still dismissive. Kids bounce back. Remember when I broke my arm climbing that oak tree? Dad said it right there in the kitchen, I reminded him, my voice flat. And you received proper follow-up care the next day. You weren't forced to climb back down the tree on your broken arm. The waiting room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. A nurse approached cautiously. Miss Mitchell, your daughter is in surgery now. It should take about 2 hours. There's a private waiting area for families if you'd prefer. I nodded gratefully. Thank you. As I gathered my purse to follow her, my mother stepped forward, her face a mask of worry. We'll wait with you. I stopped, turning to face all 3 of them. In that moment, with Sophie in surgery, fighting for her recovery, I saw my family with complete clarity. Perhaps for the very first time, these people, bound to me by blood, had repeatedly shown me who they were. I just hadn't been willing to believe it, not truly, not until they endangered my daughter. No, I said calmly, deliberately. You won't. Maya, be reasonable, my father started, taking a step towards me. Reasonable? I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that held no humor. Was it reasonable to make Sophie walk 3 miles on a broken leg? Was it reasonable to leave her alone in pain, without a working phone? Was it reasonable to prioritize a social engagement over a child's health and safety? We made a judgment call, Daniel defended, his voice firm, trying to sound authoritative. It's easy to criticize in hindsight. A judgment call, I repeated, letting the words sink in, tasting their hollowness. Well, I'm making one now, I want you to leave. My mother's face crumpled, a performance I'd seen countless times. But Sophie will have me here when she wakes up. She doesn't need to see the people who ignored her pain and caused her additional suffering, I stated simply, irrevocably. You're being dramatic, my father said dismissively, reverting to his old standby. As usual. Maybe I am, I conceded, a strange sense of calm settling over me, an unshakable resolve. But I'm also her mother, and right now, that means I need to protect her, even from family, especially from family. Daniel stepped forward, his expression hardening, his eyes flashing with anger. You know, this attitude is exactly why Nathan left you. You always blow everything out of proportion. The low blow was meant to hurt me, to make me back down, to send me scrambling for an apology as I had so many times before. Instead, I felt an odd, empowering sense of calm. Sophie is having emergency surgery because you, a trained orthopedic surgeon, decided a dinner party was more important than properly treating her broken leg, I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering as I met his. That's not blowing things out of proportion. That's stating facts. Now please leave, all of you. My father's face reddened with anger, his jaw clenching. If we leave now, he snarled, trying to inject fear, to make it a threat. Don't expect us to come back. It was meant as a threat, but it felt like freedom. I don't, I replied, my voice clear and strong. As they stormed out, muttering about ingratitude and overreaction, I felt no satisfaction, only a bone-deep weariness and an overwhelming, consuming concern for Sophie. Sound of gentle, hopeful music. The surgery lasted nearly 3 hours, longer than expected, due to the complexity of the repair and the extensive soft tissue damage. When Dr. Adams finally came to update me, his expression was cautiously optimistic. We've stabilized the fracture with a titanium rod and screws, he explained, pulling off his surgical mask. There was significant soft tissue damage that needed attention, but we're confident we've addressed all the issues. She's in recovery now and doing well. Long-term prognosis? I asked, my voice hoarse, my heart still racing. With proper follow-up care and physical therapy, she should regain full function, he reassured me. She'll need to be non-weight-bearing for at least 6 weeks, followed by a graduated return to activities. The hardware may need to be removed in a year or so, once healing is complete. I nodded, relief washing over me in a powerful wave, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. Can I see her? Sophie was groggy from anesthesia when I entered the recovery room, her right leg immobilized in a temporary splint until the swelling subsided enough for casting. Her small, pale face brightened slightly when she saw me. Mom, she whispered, her voice thick with sleepiness. You're still here. I took her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. Of course I am, sweetheart, I murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm not going anywhere. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching. Where's Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Daniel? I hesitated, uncertain how much to share in her fragile state. She was still so vulnerable. They had to go, honey, I said, choosing my words carefully. But don't worry about that now. You just focus on resting. Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, fresh tears that spilled onto the pillow. They didn't believe me, Mom. I told them how bad it hurt, but they said I was being dramatic. Uncle Daniel said I was fine. I swallowed hard against my own tears, a lump forming in my throat. I believe you, Sophie, I whispered, squeezing her hand. I always will, and I'm so sorry this happened. Blood. As she drifted back to sleep, still holding my hand, I made a silent promise to both of us. This would never happen again. No matter what it took, I would protect her, even if that meant cutting ties with the family who had betrayed us both so profoundly. The days following Sophie's surgery were a blur of hospital rooms, medication schedules, and logistical challenges. Sophie remained hospitalized for 3 days, her leg now encased in a temporary splint, while the swelling subsided. I slept in the uncomfortable recliner beside her bed, leaving only to shower in the hospital's family facilities and make necessary calls to my school and Sophie's. My principal was incredibly understanding about my extended absence, especially once I explained the circumstances. Sophie's teachers arranged to send assignments so she wouldn't fall behind. Our community, the real one, made of friends and colleagues rather than blood relations, rallied around us. My parents and Daniel made no attempt to visit during Sophie's hospital stay. Instead, they launched a relentless campaign of texts and voicemails that cycled between defensive justification and accusatory deflection. My mother claimed they were giving us space. My father insisted the doctors had overreacted with unnecessary surgery. Daniel, with his usual arrogance, suggested that Sophie's recovery would have been simpler if you hadn't rushed her to the ER and let me handle it. I read these messages with a strange detachment, as if they were artifacts from a past life. Each one only confirmed that I'd made the right decision in asking them to leave. The only family member who reached out with genuine concern was my Aunt Beatrice, my father's sister. She and my father had been estranged for years, a situation I now understood with crystal clarity. When she called after somehow hearing about Sophie's injury, her first words weren't accusations or excuses, but a simple, heartfelt, "What can I do to help?" Beatrice lived 3 hours away, but offered to drive up the following weekend to assist. "I'm not surprised Leonard and Margaret handled this poorly," she said bluntly, her voice firm and compassionate. "They did the same thing when you broke your collarbone at soccer camp. Told you to tough it out for 2 days before your coach insisted on an X-ray." I had almost forgotten that incident, buried beneath years of similar dismissals. It was just one in a long string of moments where my pain, my needs, were minimized. I thought that was normal, I admitted, the realization dawning on me. I thought all families worked that way. "It's not normal, Maya," Beatrice assured me, her voice gentle but unwavering. "It's neglect, plain and simple." That truth hit me like a physical blow. When we finally brought Sophie home from the hospital, our apartment presented new challenges. The third-floor walk-up that had never bothered us before now seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Sophie couldn't put any weight on her right leg for at least 6 weeks, meaning she needed crutches to navigate even the simplest tasks. That first night home, I helped her bathe, change, and settle into bed, both of us exhausted from the ordeal. As I tucked her in, smoothing her hair back from her forehead, Sophie asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are we ever going to see Grandma and Grandpa again? Or Uncle Daniel?" I sat on the edge of her bed, choosing my words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, my voice soft. "What they did, making you walk on your broken leg, leaving you alone when you were hurt, that wasn't okay. It wasn't safe." Sophie nodded solemnly, her eyes wide in the dim light. "I kept thinking you would have believed me. You would have taken me to the doctor right away." "Always," I promised her, my voice thick with emotion. "I will always believe you when you're hurt. And I will always make sure you get the care you need." "Grandpa said I was being dramatic," she said, her voice small, uncertain. "Like you. Is that bad, being like you?" My heart broke a little at her words, shattered by the echo of my own childhood fears. "Sophie, listen to me," I said, cupping her face in my hands. "You were not being dramatic. Your leg was broken, badly broken. The doctors confirmed that. And being like me, sweetheart, that's the greatest compliment I could ever receive. Because you are kind and brave and honest. All the things I aspire to be." She seemed to accept this, but I could see the hurt lingering in her eyes. Not just physical pain, but the deeper wound of betrayal by people she had trusted and loved. The practical aspects of Sophie's recovery proved challenging. Our health insurance covered much of the surgery and hospital stay, but the deductible, co-pays, and upcoming physical therapy sessions would strain our budget. I applied for a medical leave from work, but it would only cover a portion of my salary. My friend Sarah, a fellow English teacher, organized a meal train, bringing us dinners several nights a week. Another colleague, Ben, who lived in our building, offered to help carry Sophie up and down the stairs when necessary. My ex-husband, Nathan, called from Seattle, horrified by what had happened, and arranged to have groceries delivered weekly. The most difficult conversation was with Nathan about my parents' role in Sophie's injury. He had always liked them, finding my complaints about their behavior exaggerated, my sensitivity overblown. Now, hearing what they'd done, he was stunned into silence. "Jesus, Maya," he finally said, his voice heavy with shock. "I thought you were just being sensitive all those years. I had no idea they were capable of something like this." "Neither did I admitted, a bitter truth. "Not to this extent." "Do you want me to fly out?" he offered, genuinely concerned. "I can take some time off." The offer surprised me. Nathan hadn't taken time off for Sophie since our divorce. "No, but thank you for offering," I said, touched by his sincerity. "We're managing, but maybe you could FaceTime her more regularly? She could use the extra support right now." "Of course, anything she needs," he replied without hesitation. He paused, then asked, the question I'd been wrestling with. "And what about your parents? What are you going to do about them?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with since the hospital, the central dilemma that had consumed my thoughts. What do you do when the people who should love and protect you the most demonstrate such callous disregard? How do you reconcile the bonds of family with the urgent, overwhelming need to protect yourself and your child? "I don't know yet," I told him honestly, my voice tired. "But I know I can't let them hurt her again." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the screen glowing in the quiet apartment. I started researching. Medical neglect by grandparents. Cutting ties with toxic family. The search results were overwhelming, a dizzying array of legal jargon and psychological terms. But a link to a support group for adults estranged from parents caught my attention. I joined immediately. That night, I consulted with a family law attorney, Laura Davies, who specialized in child protection cases. I explained the entire situation, showing her Sophie's medical records and the text messages from my family. "What they did constitutes medical neglect," Laura confirmed, her voice calm and professional. "As Sophie's mother, you have every right to restrict their access to her. If you want to pursue legal action, we could potentially file for a restraining order based on the harm they caused." "I don't think it will come to that," I said, shaking my head. "They're more likely to disown me than try to force contact. But I want to understand my options." She nodded. "Document everything. Save those texts. Keep records of Sophie's medical treatment and recovery. If they do attempt to force contact or undermine your parental authority, you'll be prepared." As Sophie began her long recovery process, the magnitude of what had happened continued to unfold. Simple tasks like showering or getting to school became logistical operations. Sophie, with the incredible resilience of youth, adapted to crutches and developed impressive upper body strength. But the psychological impact was harder to measure. She began having nightmares about falling and being abandoned in the woods, waking up in a cold sweat. She grew anxious when I was out of sight for too long, her eyes following me whenever I left the room. When my mother sent her a cheerful "get well soon" card, with no acknowledgement of what they'd done, no hint of remorse or understanding, Sophie stared at it for a long time before quietly asking me to throw it away. "They don't think they did anything wrong, do they?" she asked, her voice small and knowing. "No, sweetheart," I said, sitting beside her. "They don't. Some people find it very hard to admit when they've made mistakes." She considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. "I don't want to be like that," she said, her voice firm. "I want to be able to say I'm sorry when I mess up." In that moment, I recognized that despite the trauma and pain, Sophie was learning valuable lessons about accountability, empathy, and self-worth. Lessons my parents had never managed to grasp. Lessons they actively avoided. As the days passed, my parents' and Daniel's messages grew increasingly hostile. They accused me of turning Sophie against them, of overreacting to a minor incident, of being an ungrateful daughter after all they'd done for me. Not once did any of them acknowledge the severity of Sophie's injury or express genuine remorse for their role in it. For days after bringing Sophie home from the hospital, I wrestled with the decision, but my resolve hardened. It wasn't impulsive or emotional, but the measured conclusion of a lifetime of evidence. My family had shown me repeatedly who they were. It was time I believed them. I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad, Sophie's medical records, and a deep sense of calm determination. My daughter was napping in her room, the morning's physical therapy session having exhausted her. Her temporary splint had been replaced with a full cast, bright blue at her request, already accumulating signatures from the few trusted visitors we'd welcomed. I began drafting a letter, not an angry tirade or an emotional plea, but a clear, factual account of what had happened and what would happen next. I included copies of Sophie's x-rays and the surgical report, with key phrases highlighted: displaced tibial fracture, soft tissue damage due to walking on the injury, delayed medical treatment complicating recovery. To my parents, Leonard and Margaret, I wrote, "I am providing Sophie's medical records so you can fully understand the severity of her injury. and the consequences of your decisions last weekend. As her mother, I trusted you to keep her safe. That trust has been irreparably broken. Sophie will require extensive physical therapy and may need additional surgery to remove the hardware. She will miss the remainder of her soccer season, and possibly the start of next year's. At 12 years old, she has experienced unnecessary pain and trauma that could have been avoided with basic compassion and appropriate medical attention. After considerable reflection, I've decided to terminate our relationship. This isn't a temporary cooling-off period or an emotional reaction. It's a necessary step to protect Sophie and myself from further harm, effective immediately. Do not contact Sophie directly through any means. Do not contact me except through the legal representative copied on this letter. Do not visit our home or Sophie's school. Do not attempt to use other family members as intermediaries. If you violate these boundaries, I will pursue legal protection without hesitation. I don't make this decision lightly. It comes after a lifetime of dismissal, favoritism, and emotional manipulation that I allowed to continue because I believed family connections were inherently valuable. Sophie's broken leg has broken that illusion as well. Sincerely, Maya. To Daniel, I wrote a similar letter, adding a specific paragraph that I felt he, as a medical professional, needed to hear. As a medical professional, your failure to properly assess and advocate for Sophie's injury is particularly inexcusable. You prioritize dinner plans over a child's broken leg. Your medical license may permit you to practice, but your judgment that day revealed a fundamental lack of compassion and professional ethics that no credential can disguise. I sent the letters by certified mail, ensuring delivery confirmation. Copies went to my lawyer, Laura, who had helped me draft the precise legal language. I also changed both our phone numbers and email addresses, creating new ones that only trusted friends and colleagues would receive. Sophie watched me place the letters in the mailbox outside our apartment building, her expression solemn beyond her years. "Is this forever?" she asked as we made our slow way back up the stairs, she on crutches, me carrying her backpack. "I don't know," I answered honestly. There was no point in lying to her. Right now, we need space to heal. You physically, both of us emotionally. Someday, if they can truly understand what they did and take responsibility, maybe things could be different. But that would require them to change in ways they've never shown the capacity for. She nodded thoughtfully, a small knowing look on her face. "I'm sad but also relieved. Is that weird?" "Not at all, Mad," I said, smiling faintly. "It's exactly how I feel, too." The responses came quickly and predictably. My father's lawyer contacted Laura with veiled threats about my mental stability and parental alienation. My mother sent a tearful voicemail to my school office, the only number she still had, begging to speak to Sophie, just for a minute. Daniel sent a scathing email to my new address. How he found it, I'll never know, accusing me of professional slander and threatening legal action of his own. None of them, not one, acknowledged the harm they'd caused. Laura handled the legal threats efficiently, responding with copies of Sophie's medical records and statements from her doctors about the impact of delayed treatment. The threats quieted after that, though the emotional manipulation attempts continued sporadically. Meanwhile, Sophie's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. 6 weeks of non-weight bearing turned into partial weight bearing with a walking boot. Physical therapy 3 times a week with her therapist, Olivia, helped her regain strength and mobility. Olivia incorporated psychological support as well, helping Sophie process the betrayal she'd experienced alongside the physical trauma. My Aunt Beatrice became a regular, comforting presence in our lives, driving up every other weekend to help with groceries, laundry, or simply to provide adult company for me. Through her, I learned family history I'd never known, patterns of neglect and favoritism that stretched back generations. "Your grandfather did the same to your father," she told me one evening as we shared tea after Sophie had gone to bed. "Minimized his pain, taught him to suppress emotions, favored the son who most mimicked his stoicism. Leonard became what he was raised to be." "That explains it," I said, a sigh escaping me. "But it doesn't excuse it." "No," she agreed, her gaze steady. "Understanding the origin of behavior doesn't obligate you to accept its continuation." As the weeks passed, we established new routines and traditions. Sunday mornings became pancake breakfasts with whatever toppings we craved. Friday nights were movie nights with takeout from local restaurants we'd never tried before. We started a 2-person book club, reading the same novels and discussing them over hot chocolate. In place of the family we lost, we strengthened connections with the people who showed up for us consistently, my colleagues who covered classes when Sophie had appointments, neighbors who helped with stairs and errands, even Nathan, who surprised us both by flying in for a long weekend to see Sophie and help with household projects I'd been postponing. 3 months after surgery, Sophie returned to school full-time. Her mobility was still limited, but the walking boot allowed her independence. Her friends had been incredibly supportive throughout, visiting with homework and gossip, making her feel included despite her absence. Her teachers accommodated her needs without making her feel singled out. The support group for adults estranged from parents became an invaluable resource. Through their stories, I recognized patterns in my own upbringing that I'd normalized. The constant criticism disguised as concern, the dismissal of my feelings, the golden child scapegoat dynamic between Daniel and me. I began to understand that cutting ties wasn't an act of vengeance, but of self-preservation. It was about creating space to heal, to breathe, to finally be myself. 6 months after the incident, Sophie had her hardware removal surgery, a less invasive procedure with a quicker recovery time. By then, we had received no direct contact from my parents or Daniel for nearly 3 months, though I occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that they were telling a very different version of events, casting themselves as victims of my unstable behavior and overprotectiveness. I found I no longer cared what they said. The truth was in Sophie's medical records, in the faint scar on her leg where the bone was repaired, in the therapy sessions she still attended. The truth was in our daily lives, which had grown more peaceful and authentic without the constant undercurrent of criticism and judgment. On the day Sophie was cleared to return to all normal activities, including soccer practice, we celebrated with a special dinner at her favorite restaurant. As we shared a dessert, she looked up at me with an expression of quiet contemplation. "Mom," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Daniel." My heart skipped a beat. "What about them, sweetie?" "I don't miss them as much as I thought I would," she said, tracing patterns in the chocolate sauce with her spoon. "Is that terrible to say?" "Not at all," I assured her, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Relationships should add value to your life, not drain it. Even family relationships. I miss the idea of them," she continued, articulating something I hadn't quite grasped myself. Like having grandparents who come to school concerts and an uncle who teaches me cool stuff. But the real them, they made me feel small, like my feelings didn't matter. "They made me feel that way too," I admitted, a lifetime of suppressed hurt surfacing. "For most of my life," she nodded, understanding beyond her years. "I'm glad we don't feel that way anymore." As we walked home that evening, Sophie moving confidently without crutches or limping, I realized we had both healed in ways that extended far beyond her physical recovery. We had rebuilt our sense of worth, our understanding of healthy relationships, and our definition of family. The painful incident had forced a reckoning that was long overdue, and through that crucible, we had emerged stronger. Not despite the absence of my parents and brother, but because of it. 6 months after Sophie's broken leg, our lives had found a new normal. Her physical recovery had progressed remarkably well, just as Dr. Adams had predicted. The second, less invasive surgery to remove the hardware had gone smoothly, leaving only a faint scar where the rod and screws had been. She'd returned to soccer, her coach easing her back with modified training sessions before clearing her for full participation. Her joy on the field was palpable, a testament to her incredible resilience. The emotional healing took longer for both of us. Sophie still occasionally had nightmares about being left alone while injured. Certain triggers, a particular tone of voice, the smell of pine forests, even the clicking sound of Scrabble tiles, could momentarily transport her back to that painful weekend. But with therapy and time, these moments grew less frequent and less intense. She was learning to process the trauma, to acknowledge it without letting it define her. For me, the journey involved unlearning a lifetime of conditioned responses. I found myself anticipating criticism that no longer came, defending decisions no one was questioning, apologizing for taking up space I had every right to occupy. Breaking these habits required conscious effort and constant self-awareness. It was like unwiring old circuits, painstakingly building new neural pathways. My parents hadn't given up entirely. Every few weeks, a card would arrive for Sophie, always cheerful, always avoiding any mention of what had happened, always signed with love from Grandma and Grandpa. I let Sophie decide whether to read them. Usually she didn't. They still don't get it, do they? She observed one day, holding an unopened birthday card from them. They think they can just pretend nothing happened. Some people never develop the capacity to truly acknowledge when they've hurt others, I explained gently. It threatens their self-image too much. That's sad, Sophie said with genuine compassion, a maturity that amazed me. It must be lonely never being able to say you're sorry. Daniel had apparently moved on completely. According to my Aunt Beatrice, he told extended family that I had mental health issues and had cut everyone off for no reason. Few believed him, especially after Beatrice quietly shared the actual circumstances. But it didn't matter. Daniel's inability to acknowledge his role in harming Sophie only confirmed we were better off without him. He was a professional at deflection, just like our parents. The most persistent attempts at contact came from my mother. She left messages with mutual friends, sent letters to my school, even approached Sophie's soccer coach at a game. Though thankfully, the coach, aware of the situation, politely but firmly refused to get involved. My mother's messages always followed the same pattern. She missed us, she loved us, she didn't understand why I was being so extreme, and couldn't we just move past this unpleasantness? Not once did she acknowledge what they had done or offer a genuine apology. I maintained the boundaries I'd established. The legal letters had done their job. None of them came to our home or tried to contact Sophie directly, but the emotional campaign continued, with my parents positioning themselves as wounded victims to anyone who would listen. Through the adult children of toxic parents support group, I learned this was a common tactic, what some members called the missing reasons. My parents genuinely couldn't comprehend why I had cut contact, because acknowledging the real reason would require them to see themselves as people who had harmed a child. That recognition was simply not compatible with their self-image. Understanding this dynamic didn't make it easier exactly, but it did help me stop expecting an acknowledgement that would never come. I stopped hoping for the dramatic moment of realization, the tearful apology, the healing reconciliation that movies had taught me to expect. Instead, I focused on building a life where such recognition wasn't necessary for our happiness. Sophie and I established new traditions to replace the old ones. Instead of tense holidays at my parents' mountain house, we hosted small, joyful gatherings with friends in our apartment. For Thanksgiving, we volunteered at a local shelter before enjoying our own meal with Sarah and her family. Christmas became a cozy celebration just for the two of us, with a trip to a nearby resort for skiing once Sophie was fully recovered, of course. My Aunt Beatrice remained our strongest family connection, visiting regularly and sharing stories about my grandparents and great-grandparents that helped me understand the generational patterns at play. Through her, Sophie maintained a sense of family history and belonging without the toxic elements my parents had introduced. Perhaps the most surprising development was my relationship with Nathan. Our divorce had been amicable but distant, with him pursuing his career across the country while I raised Sophie. After the incident with my parents, however, he became more present in our lives, calling Sophie regularly, visiting when he could, even helping financially with her medical expenses beyond his required child support. I should have been there more, he admitted during one visit, his voice filled with regret. Seeing how your parents failed Sophie made me realize I've been failing her too, just in a different way. His honesty and willingness to change stood in stark contrast to my parents' rigid denial. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation. We were both better as co-parents than spouses. But it was a healing of a different kind of family wound, a mending of a partnership that benefited Sophie immensely. As for Sophie, she amazed me daily with her resilience and wisdom. She approached her recovery with determination, rarely complaining despite the pain and limitations. She processed her feelings about my parents with a maturity beyond her years, expressing sadness without allowing it to define her. "You know what's weird, Mom?" she said one evening as we walked our neighbor's dog, an activity that had become part of her strength-building routine. "I think I learned more from them not being in our lives than I ever did when they were." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued by her insight. "I learned what kind of person I don't want to be," she explained, her voice clear and sure. "Someone who can't admit mistakes, someone who cares more about appearances than people's feelings. Someone who makes others feel small to make themselves feel big." Her insight took my breath away. "That's a powerful lesson, Sophie," I whispered, my eyes stinging. "Plus," she added, with the charming pragmatism of youth, "I learned that when someone shows you who they are, You should believe them the first time. Maya Angelou said that, right? I smiled, a genuine, full smile. She did, Sophie confirmed, and she was absolutely right. That ultimately was the most profound lesson from our painful experience. My parents and brother had shown me who they were countless times throughout my life. I had made excuses, normalized their behavior, blamed myself, anything to maintain the illusion that they would someday become the loving, supportive family I yearned for. It took their mistreatment, Sophie, their blatant disregard for her safety and well-being, to finally break that pattern and accept the reality. Family is not defined solely by blood. It's defined by love, respect, trust, and mutual care. Sometimes, the healthiest family is the one you choose and build, not the one you're born into. Creating boundaries, even permanent ones, with toxic relatives isn't an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation, and in my case, the protection of my child. Sophie will carry the physical scar of that weekend for life, a faint line on her leg where the bone was repaired. But the emotional scars have healed better than I could have hoped, because we addressed them honestly, sought help when needed, and removed ourselves from the source of harm. As for me, I no longer feel guilty about the estrangement from my parents and brother. I no longer lie awake wondering if I'm the unreasonable one, the overly sensitive one, the dramatic one. I know the truth of what happened, and I know that protecting Sophie was the only acceptable response. Some relationships can't be repaired because the other parties refuse to acknowledge the damage. Some broken things are meant to stay broken. The real healing comes not from forcing those broken pieces back together, but from carefully collecting the fragments that still have value and building something new, something healthier, something true. Outro music fades in. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect yourself or someone you love? How did you find the strength to follow through? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found this story helpful, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that sometimes. Walking away is the bravest thing you can do. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is not determined by those who failed to value you.